A entrevistada de hoje, em Viva Voz 3, é Reem Alsalem. Desde 2021, o Relator Especial das Nações Unidas sobre Violência contra as Mulheres e Raparigas, suas causas e consequências, por nomeação do Conselho dos Direitos Humanos da ONU. Reem Alsalem é mestre em Relações Internacionais pela Universidade Americana do Cairo e mestre em Direito dos Direitos Humanos pela Universidade de Oxford, Reino Unido. Como consultora independente em questões de género, direitos das populações refugiadas e imigrantes, justiça transicional e resposta humanitária, tem trabalhado para várias agências da ONU, como a ONU Mulheres, o Alto Comissariado das Nações Unidas para os Direitos Humanos, a Unicef e a OIM, bem como para organizações não governamentais, grupos de reflexão e universidades. Trabalhou ao serviço do Alto Comissariado das Nações Unidas para os Refugiados em 13 países, tendo planeado, implementado e monitorizado programas de proteção a pessoas sobreviventes de violência baseada no sexo, especialmente mulheres e raparigas. A entrevista é conduzida por Paula Sequeira, presidente da Dignidade, Associação para os Direitos das Mulheres e das Crianças.
Hi, I'm delighted to welcome Reem Alsalem, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, to this special edition of Viva Voz interview series. So welcome. Ms. Alsalem, thank you for accepting our invitation. It is a pleasure, and for dedicating your very precious time to share your invaluable insights and expertise. Your work has been really, really instrumental in shaping the global discourse around women's rights. And we are really honored to have you here today with us. So maybe to begin, we could share, if you could share a little bit around your career path and actually how you started this path that led you to your current position on United Nations and focusing specifically on women's and girls' rights.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to see you again, Paula. I'm Jordanian and Belgian national. I worked most of my life with the United Nations. For 17 years, I worked with the UN Refugee Agency, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. I worked with them in over 11 countries as I was an international staff. So, of course, there I worked with a lot of women and girls that had escaped violence and war and conflict. Many of them have also experienced sexual and gender-based violence. So the issue is obviously not new to me. And then in 2016, I became an independent consultant. So I continued to work with UN agencies, with also many of the big NGOs. I worked on transitional justice issues, humanitarian response, and of course also gender-based violence. Now, as a consultant, I supported one of my former colleagues, the Special Rapporteur on migrants, on the human rights of migrants. So I supported him in writing 2 thematic reports he presented to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. And so I got a much closer insights into the work of the Human Rights Council and mandate holders, and I therefore decided to apply for this position.
And we're very, very happy that you did so, because your work has been really, really important.
Thank you.
Going a little bit into the topic of violence against women. So violence against women and girls is surely the most pervasive human rights violations worldwide.
Yes.
Just in moments of war, but all that you see, even in what we call developed countries. Could you share some highlights on the scale of this issue?
Yeah, so as the UN Secretary General has said, violence against women and girls is at epidemic levels, and I couldn't agree more. It's really the silent and not so silent emergency of our times that is not being treated as the emergency that this kind of emergency deserves. I tend to look at things not only with the glass half full, but also, the the full part, in the sense that I do think that in many ways there's been progress in a number of areas when it comes to women's push for equality, for non-discrimination. So I think, for example, we can say overall that women's political participation has increased. There's a bigger realization of the fact that we need women to participate also in conflict resolution and mediation for us to have lasting peace and for countries ravaged by war and conflict to rebuild themselves. So in a number also of countries, we see more women politicians, women parliamentarians, and that's of course a good thing. The same can be said for women's economic empowerment. So I've seen a number of countries in different regions have really made concerted effort to make sure that more women are able to work in better conditions. There's also a lot more talk about equal pay, the unpaid care that often women assume. So that's also a very good thing. Of course, also there's been over the years regional human rights instruments that have specifically addressed women's rights and the right to non-discrimination and freedom from violence that have complemented international obligations. On the other hand, however, I would say that it's very concerning that even in areas where we had taken progress for granted, like women's access to education, women's access to sexual and reproductive health rights, we have seen regression in those areas. I don't think I need to speak much about Afghanistan, where it's not only girls that don't have access to education, but where women, half of society, are being marginalized and excluded and basically pushed away underground from public life. We have also seen, an attempt to, again, normalize things like female genital mutilations. In some countries, there's been attempts to legalize that. For example, in the Gambia last year, there was a push to do that. Yesterday, a law that reduced the age of marriage for girls in Iraq has passed, despite the outcry of many civil society organizations and actually parliamentarians. So these things show that standards of treatment and dignity of women and girls are being contested and there's an attempt to undermine them. Add to that is the prolific prevalence of sexual violence against women and girls. Really, we see this in many places, and I would say that the normalization or the attempt to normalize the sale of sexual acts by women, the sale of women's bodies, the commercialization of women's bodies, in part also through the normalization of pornography and the consumption of pornography, has also given more impetus and fire to this. And related to that is, of course, a proliferation of sexual violence and conflicts. There's more and more a use of sexual violence in conflict as a tool to subjugate the opponent, to control territories, to punish your opponents. And it's horrific, really. It's more and more horrific and barbaric. I would add to that what we've seen in Palestine, for example, an emerging use of reproductive violence as a tool of genocide, if I can put it that way. And I will be speaking more about that in the future. And then you add to that also the kind of violence that we are seeing online, right? With the AI, but also the just online technologies in general, communication platforms. We see more and more, again, normalization of violence against women and girls, the use of violence against women and girls that are very public in society, so that are women politicians, that are journalists, that are human rights defenders. Linked to the increasing commercialization of women's bodies is also this push to normalize surrogacy. And by that, I mean uncontrolled forms of surrogacy, where it's very easy then to exploit the surrogate mothers, and where we see examples, many examples of lack of safeguards that lead to the abuse and exploitation of the mothers, but also of the child. And then I will add to that, as an ultimate issue, the onslaught in language on what it means to be a woman, on women-specific terminology, the attempt to erase women as a group, as a class that experiences very specific forms of discrimination and violence, and also, therefore, the attempt to erase the characteristics of sex as a ground on which violence against women and girls has been inflicted for really millennia. And its confusion, therefore, or conflation with concepts like gender and gender identity. So put together, I would say we've seen some progress, but we've seen also a lot of setbacks, and we've seen new threats as well that we haven't really yet even begun to completely understand and address.
Picking your words on the commercialization of women bodies and kind of moving into the prostitution topic, if I might, your word has been really groundbreaking, championing those women rights and those girls' rights. But there are still a lot of, cultural, social, legal barriers that perpetuate these challenges faced by individuals that are really, the majority are women in prostitution. How do you envision those barriers to be really and properly and effectively addressed?
So on the issue of prostitution, I would say I added my voice to the voice of many victims over decades, many very brave women organizations, civil society organizations, and academics who have been saying that prostitution is a system of violence and exploitation against women that is sex and gender-based against women, because, as you rightly said, the overwhelming majority of victims are women and girls, and the perpetrators are males. So there's a clear sort of gendered aspect to it. The issues or the challenges to dealing with prostitution as a system of violence for what it is are many. The most recent, I think, challenge is this, again, attempt to normalize the discourse about prostitution that tries to sanitize it, that tries to misrepresent it as, first of all, something that happens by choice, something that women choose to do, something that can be either empowering or sexually liberating, something that if you legalize all aspects about it, including buying, would reduce the abuse that women face, would abuse the trafficking and violence they experience. And we know from the data, and we know from talking to victims, that that is actually not true. That legalizing the buying and selling of women's bodies actually has a counter effect. And therefore, I believe that really trying to depict prostitution as a kind of work that is like any other is an attempt to normalize and expand this kind of abuse that they face. The other challenge comes from the fact that anyone who tries to contest the depiction of prostitution as a system who tries to portray prostitution as a system of violence gets punished, gets attacked, gets sidelined. There are powerful interest groups that have access to politicians and policy-making fora, and that try to therefore influence the amendment of policies in order to normalize and legalize everything about prostitution. And I think that out of all the policy models that are out there, I have actually joined those who put forward the equality model or the Nordic model as the best approach. And that is primarily for two reasons. One, that it looks at women in prostitution as victims, and I firmly believe they are victims and should be treated as victims, meaning they should have access to assistance, protection, support, rehabilitation, and also to exit strategies. But the second most important thing is that the Nordic model also addresses the elephant in the room, which is that we need to address demand. We need to cut demand, and therefore it criminalizes the buying and the buyers, in addition to obviously criminalizing the pimping. I'm kind of glad that we are looking at it again, that a number of countries are examining this. I'm hoping that they will be bold enough to also make the link to pornography as filmed prostitution, because we will not be able to address the horrific consequences of physical prostitution without also addressing it in online spaces and online platforms.
Thank you for sharing. I want to kind of share your optimism that you share in the end, but unfortunately, even in Portugal, we see some depressing moves from our constitutional courts trying to describe prostitution as work, and even kind of trying to minimize and decriminalize pimping. The fight for progress in advancing women's rights, it's kind of always bringing those backlashes, and currently more than ever, I feel. And there's always like the emergence of new tools to undermine these gains. You mentioned prostitution, kind of the trend around empowerment that is so surreal, using empowerment connected to prostitution. And another example is the parental alienation narrative, and also the false claims narratives that particularly mothers are facing in custody disputes. So how can we, governments and organizations, but us as a society, address these challenges and ensure that when a victim goes to a legal system, they are really uphold justice and they are protected?
So as you know, I dedicated a whole thematic report in 2023 to the issue of parental alienation and how that is systematically used against mothers in family courts. And the reason I decided to do that is because one of the objectives I had for my mandate is to put the light on forms of abuse and violence being inflicted against women, groups of women that are invisible or not really understood the way they should be. And I must say, for me even, I wasn't aware of this issue until I became a rapporteur. I wasn't aware of the pervasiveness of the weaponization of parental alienation allegations against mothers, and also how family courts really inflict that kind of violence on mothers. And for me, it's really also an example of what we mean when we say that in courts there is a gender bias, that judges who are mostly males, but even if, you know, some of them might be women, they are very affected by this patriarchy. There's a push, or there's a tendency to not believe women, discredit women. There's this image about women of her being the manipulative, hysterical person in the room who's very emotional. And so you see that playing out in the court, and then suddenly this gender bias becomes very useful for a perpetrator of violence, usually the man. So if he has been inflicting either domestic or sexual abuse, either against his former partner or their child, they can use this gender bias that judges have in order to turn the tables around, and in order to detract from these accusations, and in order to suddenly put the victims in a position of perpetrators. And the whole dynamic that this has is just extraordinary. I mean, that we have allowed this and continue to allow this to happen in countries where supposedly we have rule of law, we have, justice mechanisms, that this kind of injustice is allowed to happen day in and day out, I found incredibly mind-boggling. I was really very surprised about that. I'm actually pessimistic, and I'm disappointed in how little things have changed. First of all, the interest groups that benefit from parental alienation accusations, and by that I don't only mean the partner or the parent that benefits from it, but I also mean the experts that are brought into the courts. I mean by that the what you call them, reunification camp managers, the ones that give courses about parental alienation. It's a whole industry, parental alienation, but all those came back stronger to attack those of us who have tried to cast the light on this issue and to say there's a problem. So, like in prostitution, they have vilified, they have attacked, they have defamed victims and experts and others who've tried to speak about this, and lawyers also that have defended victims. The other issue is that, unfortunately, I haven't seen the move of parliaments and politicians to discuss this issue as they should, even in countries where, as I mentioned in the report, it's a problem. So in a couple of countries, we've seen some inquiries, like in the UK, there's some discussions also in the UK Parliament, which is really welcome. We've seen, adoption of, for example, 1 or 2 laws in some US states, which is also very welcome. But then in other countries, nothing has happened. So we're still, unfortunately, far from where we should be on this issue.
Ren, thanks for sharing all your insights around parental alienation. I know, working with victims, that they feel like they are continues to be subject of violence, but now institutional violence. And one of the things that we're seeing is that even when children are considered victims, they are not protected.
Yeah, there's maybe just quickly 2 things I want to add on that. What I say in the report is precisely what you just said, that we should never forget that these are children, and therefore children should be treated in a way that international human rights law has said they should be treated in. So they should be treated in a child-sensitive manner. Their views should be taken into consideration. They should be allowed to talk in a way, of course, that a child understands, to participate in the proceedings. The best interest of the child should be the one prioritized. Somehow all that flies out of the window when the accuser is not just a parent, but is the father. Somehow the need to continuously maintain contact between child and father becomes the most important thing, and always deemed to be in the best interest, even when the facts say something else. So that is really a perverse and a way to approach the situation that is completely not child-centered, and completely flies in the face of human rights obligations of states, but also of courts. And then the second thing is that family courts seem to operate in a world of their own. It's like they're in a parallel universe where they are not subjugated to the same, let's say, requirements and laws and logic. And that was also one of the reasons why I wanted to do this report on parental alienation, because I wanted to draw attention to the fact that family courts need to also be bound by the considerations of safety, dignity of everyone involved, including mothers and children.
One topic that is becoming ever more kind of top of mind is really tech. I could not bring it here. So we already discussed it, that the fight for women's rights involves overcoming always systemic challenges. And kind of going back to the aftermath of COVID, which we know had a huge impact on women's rights, there was a tech layoff spree. So a lot of layoffs across big companies in tech.
Yes.
And they actually affected disproportionately women. So they are heavily underrepresented in technology, women, and women's voice are really underrepresented.
Yes.
And when it comes specifically to artificial intelligence, everyone is talking now an AI, these numbers are even lower. What would be, in your perspective, the key challenges of really building a future? Because we are using AI now to build a future, thinking how we will learn, how we will work. How can we build that future? And what are the key challenges for building that future with a heavy male-dominated industry?
Yeah, you obviously would know a lot more about this than me, Paula, by virtue of your hands-on and direct experience. But as many have said, first of all, there's the issue of the representation of women in the tech world, not just at lower sort of worker levels, but also at the level of who owns the tech and who manages it. We have very few women at the top. And so that, of course, results in a lot of this being seen through the male gaze or the male prism, and not geared really even to the needs of females, to the needs of women and girls. Add to that, as to what we just said previously, that a lot of the emerging and current technology is also now used to further entrench the commercialization and sale of women's bodies, and to facilitate further their abuse. I'm very concerned about well, obviously, deep fake is very concerning. Pornography, which is more and more violent, is very concerning. But there's even other forms that particularly affect adolescent girls, right? That I don't think we even understand the full scale of what they face. So unless there are also very clear rules, enforceable rules, in digital spaces that everybody has to respect, it's not an optional thing, we will not advance. And my problem, and I'd be interested in your view on this, but my problem today is that a lot of governments rely on the goodwill of technology service providers, right? It's almost like, yeah, let's try to convince them to do this or that because we want them to cooperate. Let's give them incentives. Yes, that's all very good, but you have to also have enforceable mandatory regulations that if you don't abide by them, you're going to be fined, you're going to be closed down, you're going to be criminalized, etc., etc. For example, is Pornhub. You know, Pornhub was is obliged, let's say, in the US, or was obliged in the US. And I mentioned the US because it's the example I know, to have, age verification for users and for the persons appearing in the content. Of course, they never implemented that. They never cared about that. Of course, there are many products of Pornhub that contain violence and severe abuse of persons. And, it's been a site known also for trafficking of persons. There's been lawsuits against Pornhub. And only when the states enforced the mandatory age verification did they force Pornhub to comply, at least in some states. And you know how Pornhub chose to do that? They actually shut down their presence in those states that required mandatory age verification. But that is also to show you that there has to be more enforcement on things, on regulations like that. I think this is something that has to happen at international level. So that's why there was a discussion. There was a digital compact discussion, but unfortunately it has not gone as far as it should have on the issue of rights and also sensitivity to gender and sex-related violence issues. So that's a continued conversation where we have to make progress. And I think also making sure that more women and girls, including in rural areas, in disadvantaged parts of the world, can also access tech, right? Because in a number of countries, they are still excluded. They don't even have access, let's say, to a smartphone or a phone. So the issue of access, more equitable access, and education in general is an issue. Providing incentives to women also to continue to stay in the tech world and not to leave. So we have to understand better the reasons why they are leaving, what is forcing them to leave.
I do agree with you. I think we need to have more regulation in place, and really, unfortunately, money rules. And if companies don't feel that they will be impacted, nothing will change. Reem, you mentioned you mentioned Pornhub, and I remember a couple of years ago when they were like impacted by the credit cards company that blocked payments because they had child abuse materials online. They deleted a number of volume of data from that site that was huge. And they did it in like 2 days and got back online. So the companies can do that. They had to know that the content was there, and they had to, have a way to really, in a fast way, to clean that content. So if there is no regulation, we can't expect kind of things to evolve based on goodwill, because history shows us it doesn't happen.
Exactly. And it doesn't happen in situations of trafficking, doesn't happen with slavery, which slavery was abolished voluntarily, frankly, you tell me.
Going back to the women in tech and why they leave, there's a lot of studies there, I think, but unfortunately, all the diversity and inclusion programs that are big tech companies were driven are starting to be stopped. Kind of that's what we hear more in the last weeks, and we even heard from a tech lead saying that we need more masculine or energy in the tech industry. That we're clearly not going in the right direction. Thank you for sharing all your insights in this. I would like to kind of leave with a message of hope, because we stop fighting, we can't be silent. So it is important to keep hope and the energy to fight. So could you share any recent success or breakthroughs, either globally or locally, that we can kind of nurture that hope?
There is always hope, and the hope is kept alive by the resilience, really, and fight and efforts of not only survivors, but also civil society, women who often risk everything in order to tell the truth, in order to fight for their rights, in order to make their voices heard. And even with the increasing challenges and resistance and opposition they meet, they're still there. They're still fighting and working hard. Sisterhood is something that cannot be replaced and cannot be eliminated. And it's very strong today more than ever. I think collectively we realize how many threats we're having, as the world gets more complex. Tech and online technology has also provided us with ways of being able to reach out also more easily to each other and build alliances and get the word out there. Since we talked about prostitution, I think the decision by the European Court on Human Rights on the last case brought against France is a win. So this was an effort to try to force France to abolish the Nordic model, to say that you cannot criminalize the buying of sexual acts because it's supposedly a violation of human rights. And the court said, actually, no, that France has not violated rights by trying to stem the demand for sexual acts, the buying of sexual acts. So that is an important win, and it would not have been possible without also behind the scenes and many women's organizations, NGOs, experts joining forces and also supporting the French position and participating in this case. So it's not an easy road. We have less resources available than many of our adversaries, but we remain undeterred. And so I'm hopeful.
Thank you for sharing that message of hope and also some good examples that can make us kind of look forward with some positive thinking. Kind of just to wrap up the interview, what advice would you give to any woman that wants to, that aspire to make a difference, to continue the good fight through international organizations, for instance, like the United Nations?
So I think you can make a difference not only through the UN or international organizations. You can start where you are in your own environment, whether it's your own family, village, city, neighborhood. Everyone can make a difference. Everyone can take an action that can have a positive impact. And of course, if you do want to work through international organizations, that's great, but it's not the only avenue for impact, I would say. Maybe also do a proper assessment of where the gaps are, and before just sort of throwing yourself into something, in order not to replicate anything that is already sort of happening. First go in, see where the needs are, see if you're the best one to be able to address it, and then just go with it. Yeah. So.
Thank you. And thank you, Reem, for sharing your time and your invaluable insights with us here today in Viva Voz. And it's been deeply appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much.